History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 5, The Making of European Age. Chapter 3, The New World of Great Powers. The glitter with which Catherine subsequently surrounded herself masked a great deal and took in many of her contemporaries. Among the things it almost hid was the bloody and dubious route by which she came to the throne. It may be true, though, that she rather than her husband might have been the victim if she had not struck first. In any case, the circumstances of her accession and of those of her predecessors showed the weakening of the autocracy that had undergone since Peter. The first part of her reign was a ticklish business. Powerful interests existed to exploit her mistakes and for all her identification with her new country. She was a foreigner. I shall perish or reign, she once said, and reign she did, to great effect. Though Catherine's reign was more spectacular than that of Peter the Great, its innovatory force was less. She, too, founded schools and patronized the arts and sciences. The difference was that Peter was concerned with practical effect, Catherine rather to associate the prestige of enlightened thinkers with her court and legislation. The forms were often forward looking, while the reality was reactionary. Close observers were not taken in by legislative rhetoric. The reality was shown by the exile of the young Radishchev, who had dared to criticize the reign and has been seen as Russians' first dissident intellectual. Such reforming impulses as Catherine showed perceptibly weakened as the reign went on, and foreign considerations distracted her. Her essential caution was well shown by her refusal to tamper with the powers and privileges of the nobility. She was the czarina of the landlords, giving them greater power over the local administration of justice, and taken away from their serfs the right to petition against their masters. Only 20 times in Catherine's 34-year reign did the government act to restrain landlords abusing their powers over their serfs. Most significant of all, the obligation to service was abolished in 1762, and a charter of rights was later given to the nobility, which sealed a half century of retreat from Peter's policies towards them. The gentry were exempted from personal taxation. Corporal punishment and billeting could be tried only by their peers and were given the exclusive right to set up factories and mines. The landowner was, in a sense, taken into partnership by the autocracy. In the long run, this was pernicious. Under Catherine, Russia began to truss herself more and more tightly into the corset of her social structure at a time when other countries were beginning to loosen theirs. This would increasingly make Russia unfit to meet the challenges and changes of the next half century. One sign of trouble was the scale of serf revolt. This had begun in the 17th century, but the most frightening and dangerous crisis came in 1773, the rebellion of Pugachev, the worst of the great regional uprisings which studied Russian agrarian history before the 19th century. Later, better policing would mean that revolt was usually local and containable, but it continued through almost the whole of the imperial era. Its recurrence is hardly surprising. The load of labor services piled on the peasant rose sharply in the Black Earth Zone during Catherine's reign. Soon, critics would appear among the literate class, and the condition of the peasant would be one of their favorite themes, thus providing an early demonstration of a paradox evident in many developing countries in the next 2 centuries. It was becoming clear that modernization was more than a matter of technology. If you borrowed Western ideas, they could not be confined in their effect. The first critics of orthodoxy and autocracy were beginning to appear. Eventually, the need to preserve an ossifying social system would virtually bring to a halt the changes which Russia needed to retain the place that courageous and unscrupulous leadership and seemingly inexhaustible military manpower had given her. By 1796, when Catherine died, this place was indeed impressive. The most solid ground of her prestige was her armies and diplomacy. She had given Russia 7 million new subjects. She said she had been well treated by Russia, to which she had come, a poor girl with 3 or 4 dresses, but that she had paid her debts to it with Azov, the Crimea, and the Ukraine. This was in the line of her predecessors. Even when the monarchy was weak, the momentum of Peter's reign carried the foreign policy of Russia forward along two traditional lines of thrust into Poland and towards Turkey. It helped that Russia's likely opponents labored under growing difficulties for most of the 18th century. Once Sweden was out of the running, only Prussia or the Habsburg Empire could provide a counterweight, and since these two were often at loggerheads, Russia could usually have her own way over both an ailing Poland and a crumbling Ottoman Empire. In 1701, the Elector of Brandenburg, with the consent of the emperor, became a king. His kingdom, Prussia, was to last until 1918. The Hohenzollern dynasty had provided a continuous line of electors since 1415, steadily adding to their ancestral domains, and Prussia, then a duchy, had been united to Brandenburg in the 16th century after a Polish king had ousted the Teutonic Knights who ruled it. Religious toleration had been Hohenzollern's policy after an elector was converted to Calvinism in 1613, while his subjects remained Lutheran. One problem facing the Hohenzollerns was the spread and variety of their lands, which spread from East Prussia to the west bank of the Rhine. The Swedes provided infilling for this scatter of territories in the second half of the 17th century, though there were setbacks even for the great elector, Frederick William, the creator of the Prussian Standing Army and winner of the victories against the Swedes, which were the basis of the most enduring military traditions in modern European history. Arms and diplomacy continued to carry forward his successor to the knightly crown he coveted and to participation in the Grand Alliance against Louis XIV. Prussia was by that fact alone clearly a power. This imposed a heavy cost but careful housekeeping and again built up the best army and one of the best filled treasuries in Europe by 1740, when Frederick II came to the throne. He was to be known as the Great because of the use he made of them, largely at the expense of the Habsburg and the Kingdom of Poland, though also at the expense of his own people, whom he subjected to heavy taxation and exposed to foreign invasion. It is difficult to decide whether he was more or less attractive than his brutal father, whom he hated. He was certainly malicious, vindictive, and completely without scruple. But he was also highly intelligent and cultivated, playing and composing for the flute and enjoying the conversation of a cleverer man. He was like his father in his utter devotion to the interests of his dynasty, which he saw as the extension of the territories and the magnification of its prestige. Frederick gave up some possessions too remote to be truly incorporated in the state, but added to Prussia more valuable territories. The opportunity for the conquest of Silesia came when the emperor died in 1740, leaving a daughter whose succession he had sought to assure but whose prospects were uncertain. This was Maria Theresa. She remained Frederick's most unforgiving opponent until her death in 1780, and her intense personal dislike for him was fully reciprocated. A general European war of the Austrian succession left Prussia holding Silesia. It was not to be lost in later wars, and in the last year of his reign, Frederick formed a league of German princes to thwart the attempts of Maria Theresa's son and successor, Joseph II, to negotiate the acquisition of Bavaria as a recompense for the Habsburg inheritance. This episode matters more to European history as a whole than might be expected of a contest for a province, however rich, and for the leadership of the princes of Germany. At first sight, a reminder of how alive still in the 18th century were the dynastic preoccupations of the past. It is also, and more importantly, the opening of a theme with a century of life to it and consequences great for Europe. Frederick launched a struggle between Habsburg and Hohenzollern for the mastery of Germany, which was only to be settled in 1866. That is further ahead than may be usefully considered at present, but this context gives perspective to the Hohenzollern appeal to German patriotic sentiment against the emperor, many of whose essential interests were non German. There would be periods of good relations, but in the long struggle, which began in 1740, Austria's great handicap would always be that she was both more and less than a purely German state. The disadvantages of the spread of her interests were made very obvious during the reign of Maria Theresa. The Austrian Netherlands were an administrative nuisance rather than a strategic advantage, but it was in the East that the worst distractions from German problems arose, and they became increasingly pressing as the second half of the century brought more and more clearly into view the likelihood of a long and continuing confrontation with Russia over the fate of the Ottoman Empire. For 30 years or so, Russo Turkish relations had been allowed to slumber with only occasional minor eruptions over the building of a fort or the raids of the Crimean Tatars, one of the peoples originating in a fragment of the Golden Horde and under Turkish suzerainty. Then, between 1768 and 1774, Catherine fought her most successful war, a peace treaty with the Ottomans signed in an obscure Bulgarian village called Kuchuk Kainarji was one of the most important of the whole century. The Turks gave up their suzerainty over the Crimean Tatars, an important loss both materially because of their military manpower and morally because this was the first Islamic people over which the Ottoman Empire ceded control. And Russia took the territory between the Bug and Dnieper, together with an indemnity and the right of free navigation on the Black Sea and through the straits. In some ways, the most pregnant with future opportunity of the terms was a right to take up with the Turks the interests of the church to be built in Constantinople and those who serve it. This meant that the Russian government was recognized as a guarantor and protector of new rights granted to the Greek, that is, Christian subjects of the Sultan. It was to prove a blank check for Russian interference in Turkish affairs. This was a beginning, not an end. In 1783, Catherine annexed the Crimea. Another war with the Turks carried her frontier up to the line of the Dniester. The next obvious boundary ahead was the Pruth, which meets the Danube 100 miles or so from the Black Sea. The possibility of Russia's installation at the mouth of the Danube was to remain an Austrian nightmare, but the danger which appeared in the east before this was that Russia would swallow Poland. With the eclipse of Sweden, Russia had effectively had her own way at Warsaw. She left her interests to be secured through a complained Polish king. The factions of the magnates and their quarrels blocked the road to reform, and without reform, Polish independence would be a fiction because effective resistance to Russia was impossible. When there seemed to be, for a moment, a slight chance of reforms, these were checkmated by skillful Russian exploitation of religious divisions to produce confederations which speedily reduced Poland to civil war. The last phase of Poland's independence history had opened when the Turks declared war on Russia in 1768 with the excuse that they wished to defend Polish liberties. 4 years later, in 1772, came the first partition of Poland in which Russia, Prussia, and Austria shared between them about one third of Poland's territory and one half of her inhabitants. The old international system, which had somewhat artificially preserved Poland, had now disappeared. After two more partitions, Russia had done best on the map, absorbing something like 180,000 square miles of territory. Though in the next century, it would be clear that a population of dissident Poles was by no means an unambiguous gain. And Prussia also did well, emerging from the division of booty with more Slav than German subjects. The transformation of Eastern Europe since 1500 was complete, and the stage was set for the 19th century, when there would be no booty left to divert Austria and Russia from the Ottoman succession problem. Meanwhile, independent Poland disappeared for a century and a quarter. Catherine rightly claimed to have done much for Russia, but she had only deployed a strength already apparent. Even in 1730s, one Russian army had been as far west as Neckar. In 1760, another marched to Berlin. In 1770s, there was a Russian fleet in the Mediterranean. A few years later, a Russian army was campaigning in Switzerland, and after 20 years, another was to enter Paris. The paradox at the heart of such evidences of strength was that this military power was based on a backward social economic structure. Perhaps this was inherent in what Peter had done. The Russian state rested on a society with which it was fundamentally incompatible, and later Russian critics would make much of this theme. Of course, this did not mean that the clock would be put back. The Ottoman Empire was forever gone as a serious competitor for the power, while Prussia's emergence announced a new age as much as did Russia's. The future international weight of the United Provinces and Sweden had been unimaginable in 1500, but their importance too had come and gone by 1800. They were then still important nations but of the second rank. France was still to be a front rank power in an age of national states as she had been in the days of 16th century dynastic rivalry. Indeed, her power was relatively greater and the peak of her dominance in Western Europe was still to come. But she faced a new challenger too, and one which had already defeated her. From the little English kingdom of 1500, cooped up in an island off the coast of Europe under an upstart dynasty, had emerged the world power of Great Britain. This was a transformation almost as surprising and sudden as Russia's. It transcended the old categories of European diplomacy quite as dramatically. From what some historians have called the Atlantic archipelago of islands and kingdoms, ruled intermittently in varying measure and extent by Tudor and Stuart monarchs, had emerged a new oceanic power. Beside its new unity, it enjoyed unique institutional and economic advantages in deploying its influence worldwide. In 300 years, the major zones of European conflict and dispute had migrated from the old battlegrounds of Italy, the Rhine, and the Netherlands, moving from them to central and eastern Germany, the Danube Valley, Poland, and Carpathia, and the Baltic, but also, greatest change of all, across the oceans. A new age had indeed begun, signaled not only by the remaking of Eastern Europe, but in the wars of Louis XIV, the first world wars of the modern era, imperial and oceanic in their scope.